He was a baby.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
this is
talking
lovely.
literally.
One more.
She, Jeff and our daughter are about a month apart in age.
Oh, wow.
Very close.
You know, I'd love a picture.
We watched both of them growing up. Yeah.
Good.
If you
Yeah.
don't mind, I'd love a picture with you as well.
Oh, sure.
Just,
Would you like all three of you in it?
ah, what a nice idea. Let's see, perhaps we could even do
Do us all, yeah.
no, that won't.
Might be better, especially if we're doing three.
Might be best, yeah, just a second.
There we are.
Well,
Look at that.
Oh, no.
And just work together, David and,
Right.
sorry.
But
Which
this
is-
side or the other
Where's
side?
it?
Yeah.
I think, I'm not sure, but
Check that.
The two Davids worked
Perhaps
together at the
it's-
Department of Justice before, yeah, that's where they met, or we all met.
Okay.
It was through the
So
Department of
it's probably
Justice.
in that area.
Oh, my. Paying attention.
There you are.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us tonight for a book talk by Angie Littlefield and Grace Feuervenger about.
sorry,
That's-
I'm just thinking that perhaps you should go first because this is all set up.
It's set up all the time.
Oh,
And she's taping.
sorry.
Oh, okay.
'Cause,
Iris, start again.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us tonight for a book talk about the memoirs of Angie Littlefield and Grace Feuervenger, which are Walking with Oma and Winter Light, about their experiences growing up as the children of Holocaust survivors. This is a special program for Holocaust Education Week, and we're here in person at St. Mary Magdalene's Anglican Church and online. And without further ado, I will turn it over. Grace.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming. So, I'm going to read something that I put together and then a few excerpts from my book. But let me start by saying that my memoir, Winter Light, was not supposed to have been written, let alone published. I have actually broken all the rules that dominated my family life when I was growing up. But somehow I feel as if I was compelled to write this memoir. Some mysterious force pushed me forward because I felt that I had to add a certain different piece to the literature of Holocaust works, especially memoirs. Because you see, it wasn't the language and culture of my people that saved me. It was the language and culture of strangers. At the core of my story stands a little girl struggling to find a path toward the life force and to escape from the demons of despair that permeated her home. My memoir is about a sequence of serendipitous rescues, an emotional rags to riches story. I think that my memoir, Winter Light, is unusual in that most Holocaust memoirs that have so far been published are for the most part from families who had a certain social, educational opportunity before the war. Those stories that have been published depict survivors as heroically determined to rebuild their lives after the war, despite their devastating losses. And they encourage their children to live as fully as possible in the new society. My memoir stands in stark contrast to these, in that my parents had never known anything other than blinding poverty, visceral anti-Semitism, and lack of any educational or social opportunities before the war. No cultural or political affiliations either. So they had no role models that they could fall back on after the war. My parents arrived in Montreal in 1948, penniless, emotionally broken, carrying with them all the ghosts of their murdered relatives. I was born several years later. With an emotionally unstable mother and a father consumed by sorrow and inner rage, I was always searching for shelter. And I knew from the start that my home was the last place on earth where I would find it. Neither of my parents were able to encourage my own ambitions as I was growing up. And yet I was a child who was really eager to be out there in the world. But at every turn, I had to battle those demons hissing their frightening, grim messages. How dare you? Was the mantra that reverberated in my home. I felt like a traitor, and sometimes in the dead of night, I still do. Writing Winter Light has helped me better understand my mother's suffering and how it affected me so deeply. It turns out that her illness was there well before the Holocaust, but of course the war exacerbated it. When a very wise and compassionate therapist, one of my serendipitous rescues, God rest his soul, explained all this to me years later, I felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Suddenly, I began to see my parents more clearly and to realize that it hadn't been my fault, which is what all children coming from places of trauma feel, no matter what the circumstances. But what great good fortune was visited upon me. It all started in my beloved hometown, Montreal, and it was the chance of a lifetime. I was almost 4 years old when I discovered the joie de vivre of my French-Canadian neighbors in the working-class East End of Montreal, and I will forever be grateful to have grown up in their midst. They offered me the first glimpse of hope in this world. Also, a shimmering light seemed to call to me in the winter mornings of my childhood through the Jack Frost designs on the kitchen window. Those crystalline designs were like a road map, pushing me, pointing me toward new horizons. And I was mesmerized by that light. As I grew older, there were more rescues from unexpected people and places and educational institutions, and I reached out to them as toward a life raft. Perhaps the greatest rescue of all was to have found my life partner, my soulmate, when we were very young students in Berkeley, California. He is also a child of Holocaust survivors, and we have saved each other over and over again. So Winter Light is a story of gratitude to whatever cosmic force allowed me to discover the grandeur of things, the potential of a larger life, both personally and professionally. And when I say gratitude, I truly mean it. Of course, there are other children of Holocaust survivors who lived in emotionally and socially deprived circumstances as I did, but I don't think they've written about it. Not yet. I hope that my memoir will lend voice to their experiences and to speak for all children coming from places of trauma, be it abuse, poverty, war, isolation, and other oppressions. And we know this is happening in so many parts of the world right now as we speak. Let me end by saying that I think memoir is about the sanctity of keeping memory alive. And memory can break our hearts, but it can also heal. And I hope that my story may connect with the larger story of how we must all try to discover the means to triumph over adversity, to keep following the light, especially when there is so much darkness. It's about the vast unknown territory of the human heart, where love and hope can rise above everything, in spite of the ghosts that still haunt us. And now I'm going to read a few excerpts from my book just to whet your appetite. And there are some books here. They make great gifts, but I'm going to start. It was so hard to choose which pieces to read in this limited amount of time, but I'm going to start with chapter 1, the beginning of chapter 1. And you see, as I mentioned, I grew up in a French-Canadian neighborhood. And my best friend lived right next door in the fourplex next to our fourplex. And she was, of course, we were the only Jewish family in the neighborhood. And one day, I was about 4, I was invited to dinner at their place, and I was really excited. I always felt safe. So this is sort of in the middle of chapter 1. I always felt safe in Françoise's home. The lights seemed brighter there, and no members of Hitler's Gestapo seemed to be hiding in or under any bed. I remember my first invitation for dinner. I was excited, yet also nervous that I might do or say something wrong and they wouldn't want to see me again. But when the moment arrived and I was seated at their table with its chrome trimming and their plastic padded chairs, I was able to relax. The soup on the stove bubbled just as it would in our house. And Françoise's mother brought the big pot to the table, holding each ear with bright green oven mitts. She set down the pot and then dished out thick yellow pea soup into our bowls with a ladle which looked a lot like the one my mother had. The soup smelled so hearty. Maybe it came from the same can of Campbell's Habitant soup au pois, with its bright yellow label that my mother bought as well. It was as if it wrapped me in its simple warmth. The huge, crusty bread on the table looked freshly baked. After the soup came a steamy round pie filled with meat that smelled like cinnamon and other mysterious spices. Madame le Duc cut the meat pie, which is called tourtière, into wedges, and gave me a bright smile when she noticed how my eyes fell upon it in anticipation. The radio played in the background, and my ears picked up on that fancy language that the Leduc family all spoke around the table. It twirled and trilled and tossed ours around as if it were on a carousel. I'm now going to go a little further into this chapter, but I'm still at dinner at Françoise's home. Sometime during the meal, I looked up at the wall and saw an image of a half-naked man hanging on a wooden cross. He wore thorns in his hair, and his head was slumped to one side. Was that a red gash in his rib? Was he dead? I understood in an instant that he was the one they loved so much, the one they accused the Jews of having killed. Many confusing thoughts ran through my young brain. This man, whom they call Jesus, had, like my parents and my other relatives, suffered terribly. Was there any connection? I was too afraid to ask, but one thing was clear. If he had suffered so much, then he must have been Jewish. And just looking at him up there on that cross, it seemed clear that was the case. This was a startling revelation, and yet I knew in my heart that it must be true. I'm going to go much further now. I'm in chapter 6 now, and I'm just going to read you a bit about, because I came from a very multilingual home given my parents' background, and so this chapter is called Languages at Home, and I'm just going to read a little as to how I sort of as a child tried to figure out the two languages that were in my home and that had a very unusual relationship with one another. Languages swirled about both inside and outside, in the private world of my home as well as in the public world of my neighborhood. The languages inside my home, Polish and Yiddish, both floated into my ears and offered sustenance, like fluttering angels. Polish and Yiddish, sweet, melodious, soothing. Words became sentences, which I began to understand, and I felt I could count on them. Their meaning and their intent. They nourished me in ways that my poor parents couldn't do. I soon learned to listen for the soft, sonorous cadences of more and more words every morning, and later on I began to parrot them. In my hunger for love, bless you, I grabbed hold of them and made them my own. These words were filled with abundance, and they made me forget about the bad things that seemed to creep around my house and that could pounce on my parents in those moments, making them feel so frightened or angry or mean. As I grew older, I noticed that Polish was spoken between my parents, and it had such a lyrical sound. Even today, when I hear Polish, it feels to me like a silken garment. But this turned out to be a stolen pleasure. I learned early on that my parents spoke Polish, but for them it was very much reserved for their own communication, not for the children. There seemed to be a fence around it, which we as children were not permitted to penetrate. It seemed that they didn't want us to learn that language. As a child, I didn't make an issue of this. It just was the way it was. But that was the way it was. All I wanted at the time was to figure out what it was they were saying to each other. Although I cracked the code early, I knew that my knowledge of that language had to remain passive. Something was wrong with it. And only later did I discover exactly what it was. I knew it wasn't a mere matter of communicating. My parents were able to discuss anything using that language. They read and wrote in Polish, and my father especially enjoyed literature and poetry in Polish. I also loved to hear my mother speak on the telephone with her friends in Polish. She had such a lilting voice in Polish, so flowing and free, not like the way she hobbled her way through English. Eventually I understood that my parents were ambivalent about using Polish with us, their children. Though it had been their everyday language back in Poland. There was another much more powerful thing that I sensed well before my parents put it into words. Polish and Yiddish were not friends with each other. That's the way I discussed it in my own mind. This tension between the two languages was oppressive. They inhabited the same space in my home, but strong, invisible borders held them apart. Only by means of listening could I transcend those borders and enjoy the dangerous presence of Polish in my home. I learned as I grew older that it was dangerous because it symbolized the unfortunate anti-Semitism in Poland at that time. Even after the Poles themselves were subjugated by the Nazis, some took out their rage on an even weaker victim, the Jews. So Yiddish was deemed to be the proper medium of communication between my parents and their children in our home. Yiddish was our language, that of the Jewish people of Eastern Europe. It was a gentle and expressive language. However, Yiddish was a bird with a broken wing. It had barely survived an unspeakable catastrophe. This is how I came to know that Yiddish was not merely a language, but also the reservoir of Eastern European Jewish hopes and dreams and sorrows. The same was true for Polish, although it was in the reservoir for the Polish Catholic people who had their own hopes and dreams, and who also felt a deep sense of vulnerability about their identity. I go on and discuss this more, of course, in that chapter, and there are many, many more chapters that I have to skip, but I will read you. I'm now going much later on in my life when I was at the end of my second year at McGill University in Montreal. And this is what happened to me. It was like a Cinderella story. I was offered a scholarship to study in Perugia, Italy for 6 months, all expenses paid. It really was unbelievable. And so I want to read you just the first paragraph or so of when I first arrived in Perugia. And of course that changed my life. It was my first trip to Europe and it opened the world to me. I arrived in Perugia with a head full of steam and a singing heart. South and east of Florence in the province of Umbria, Perugia is built like a medieval fortress, some 1,600 feet above sea level. Steep hills abound, and many of the streets consist of stone steps, invariably leading up to the only level part of the city, the Centro Storico, historic center, with its ancient flowing fountain and the Cattedrale di San Lorenzo. I walked the city's labyrinthine streets with their steep stairways, as if in reverie, surrounded by the lyrical language of Italian, and by breezes perfumed with the flowers that were scattered everywhere. I learned that the Etruscans, of whom virtually nothing is known, settled in Umbria and Tuscany, and they were noted artisans and builders. They sculpted delicate stone figurines, little statues indented in the walls of buildings. These walls survived many wars, many earthquakes, and they were still standing. They didn't use mortar, but instead they carved stone to fit perfectly. And when the Romans conquered the Etruscans, they didn't destroy what the Etruscans had built. Instead, the Roman arches and walls were constructed above and below whatever that was already there. They did not destroy anything that the Etruscans had built. These figurines were so beautiful. My pensione, run by a certain Signora Frizza, was situated on a narrow and steep street called Via Pinturicchio, named after a local painter. She was a battle axe of a woman who didn't let any nonsense escape her vision. All her boarders had to obey her rules. This resulted in a spotless place and exquisite meals. The taste of her pasta, and especially her penne, with black truffles, and her mouth-watering minestrone soup delighted my taste buds. The grilled vegetables were drenched in the local varieties of olive oil. The chicken cooked in rich red wine, or the roasted lamb served with lentils, farro, and polenta could make my taste buds lose their bearings. It was hearty and simple, cucina povera, and in some ways it reminded me of the French-Canadian meals that I had enjoyed in my childhood, in my neighborhood, at my friend Françoise's home. I always asked for seconds and even thirds, and Signora Frizza loved me for that. But as for running around with local Italian boys, I call them boys because they really were just as young or younger than I was at age 18. I was going on 19 in a few months. Signora Frizza turned cold as stone. Tu sei disgraziata. You are disgraceful, she would say, pointing an accusatory finger at me. Quite unaware of my innocence, I would end up on motorcycles with boys racing around town, and when they wanted to go further than a kiss or two, I fought them off. Why I even got myself into these situations shows my contradictory behavior, because I was a frightened little girl who had no intention of letting myself be carried away. After I realized that the boys talked up and exaggerated their dates with me, I stopped paying them any attention. In any case, no one could have imagined that the wild attitude that I displayed there was nothing but a mask. And I'm going to end with, and this is again much further on. This is after my beginning of my graduate work at Berkeley, California, and I had met my husband, as I mentioned, in Berkeley, and we came back to Canada. It's a long time ago, the mid-1970s, and for 2 years we lived in Edmonton, Alberta, and then we moved to Toronto. We're talking the mid-1970s, and Toronto even then, in the mid-1970s, was a very multicultural city. Now, of course, even more so, it's so much larger, but when I first got there, I was interviewed by a principal in an elementary school. I became, by the way, an elementary school teacher. I let my PhD studies go for a while. That is all in the book. It's a long story. It was a detour. Turned out to be one of the greatest blessings of my life, because being in an elementary school classroom helped me to reconstruct and enjoy a childhood which I could not enjoy when I was a child. So some force, some higher power was pointing me in a way toward healing right at the beginning of my life, and then onward even into my first profession, which was elementary school teaching. So I'm going to read you just a piece of that first day in Toronto. We had just arrived from Edmonton. I had gotten my teacher diploma and so on, and I was going to teach a grade 5 classroom, newly minted teacher. I had not taught before, and there I was. It was the day after the Labor Day weekend. I had spent a whole weekend decorating this classroom. I was extremely excited. So here I am standing at the door, the bell is about to ring, and the children are about to come into the first classroom of my elementary school profession. I stood by my door with a sense of adventure, waiting for my students to arrive. I watched their faces as each child shuffled in, faces marked by neglect, by poverty, by not knowing that their lives had meaning. I should mention, it was an inner city school in Toronto, very tough, and I remember that weekend, my next door neighbor teacher, who was, she looked 100 years old, but in any case, she came to the door with a frown on her face and said, "Oh, you're the new teacher. You've got the worst class in the school. You're not gonna make it to Christmas." That was my welcome. So there I am, and these kids came from very troubled homes. I had been told that there were no fewer than 10 cultural groups that were represented in that class. And I felt in awe of the possibilities inherent in their faces. They reminded me of the places where I had grown up in the working class East End of Montreal. I felt that I had an important role, and I wanted to respect the complexities of these children's lives. It soon became apparent that I was both an insider and an outsider. Insider because I had grown up in similar circumstances to theirs, but an outsider because I was an adult, a teacher, an authority figure. No sooner had the children settled into their seats that they started jumping out of them. Paper airplanes began to fly through the air. I somehow got through the roll call. Names from everywhere. I tried hard to pronounce all of them properly. But I became alarmed when I found myself yelling for attention. This was not the vision of the teacher I wanted to become. And it wasn't even an hour into my new career. "It's a tough school, you'll never make it to Christmas," Anne's words echoed in my ears. I had prepared a reading lesson, and it was based on those dreadful basal readers, which really had no meaning. It was just words in a predetermined sequence. I mean, you all may have gone through that. I remember I did too. And there's no doubt that they just wouldn't have meaning for these particular children. How could they relate to such contrived and uninteresting material, especially when many of them couldn't even read yet, even though they were in grade 5? So this was a pretty difficult task for me. At that moment, as total chaos was about to break out, my eyes turned to the shelf that housed those readers. I made a decision which I knew would make or break my status as teacher in the minds and the eyes of these students. I marched over to the shelf and gathered up as many of these books as I could hold. Fortunately, my classroom was not located on the ground floor, and fortunately, it was not raining outside. I strode over to the window, opened it wide, and then I proceeded to throw out the books. I literally threw them all out the window. The children stopped their running about, returned to their seats, and sat down. All their disbelieving eyes were upon me as the proverbial pin could have dropped. This is what I said to my students. I don't blame you for not being interested in these books or reading. They look pretty dull to me too. I wouldn't want to waste my time with them, and I won't waste your time with them either. Their eyes grew larger. They looked bewildered, and I was starting to relax. Books should be full of stories that catch your attention, I went on. Those are the kinds of stories we're going to read together in my class. Have any of you ever heard of Greek myths? They are stories about ancient gods and goddesses and all their adventures. I saw the wonder that began to envelop the children. I don't know whether theirs was wonder at the anticipation of reading Greek myths, or at the prospect of spending a year with such a strange new teacher. Whatever the reason, this became a sacred moment. And I think I'll stop there. And I hope I've whetted your appetite to read on. Thank you very much.
We will do questions at the end,
Yeah.
both of us together. And now is the All right, we're on in education, Holocaust Education Week. It runs from Kristallnacht, which is usually around November the 3rd, to the 9th. And so we have spoken at a United Church. We're speaking at 2 Anglican churches. We're speaking at a synagogue, and we are speaking at the Arts and Letters Club. We are doing our own Holocaust Education Week, spread out over the month. And we're doing that because the history of Holocaust Education Week has been about survivors. And I volunteer at the Holocaust Museum every Sunday. I have since it opened 2 years ago. And I have been fortunate enough to see survivors. But the survivors are now all in their late 90s. And one of the survivors who actually still speaks, she had her 100th birthday in December. And so the survivors know that their stories, they're going to be in print. Some of them are visually captured through testimony, but they're not going to be around to speak anymore. So the second generation, which is what Grace and I are, we are going to tell their stories, but we're telling their stories refracted. So they come through our experiences. And our experiences as children or survivors are totally different. And in many cases, and Grace has talked about it, you come from very damaged people trying to raise children. So they've survived the horrors of the concentration camps. Many of them don't have proper education because under the Nuremberg laws, they were not allowed to go to school anymore. Most countries don't want them, including Canada. Canada had anti-Semitic laws, immigration laws until 1947, and only then did they let in people. About 40,000 Jewish refugees came to Canada at that point. We did not come with that wave, my family, and the reason we didn't come was because we're German, and understandably, not too many countries wanted Germans. If they didn't want Jewish people, they certainly did not want Germans either. So it was a bit of a struggle. And why did we want to come? Because even though my family was German, my mother had been in a concentration camp. My grandmother was 18 months in a concentration camp. And pretty much the entire generation above them was wiped out in concentration camps. So the urge to come to freedom was extremely strong, and they persevered and came to Canada through a brother. Some of that is going to come out as I go through talking, but I was recently with my brother, so we came to Canada in 1954. I was 6, he was 8 when we came to Canada. And he's now 80. I'm about to turn 79 in December. And so he's not doing so well. So I said to him, let's talk about those people who will have no one to speak for them anymore after the two of us are gone. Because there's a saying that you live as long as those people who remember you. And so we sat down, the two of us, and we told stories about the joint people keeping them alive, in our memory at least. So I'm telling the stories too, and I told them the story about how I ran away from daycare when I was 4 years old. And I didn't like the fact that they made children nap, and I was always rebellious. I'm president of the Heliconian Club, and there are 2 Heliconians here this evening, so they will know when I say that I've always been rebellious, that they may have seen some of that in my nature. So I managed to walk out of the daycare. They didn't have the lockdowns that they have nowadays, and walked under the turnstile of the subway because I was short enough to make it under, and spent the day riding back and forth on the subway. I was only 4, but I was smart enough to know that if you sat with a family, you couldn't get caught. So every time a family got up and left, I just found another family. I have no idea how I made it, how they found me. I did get told off quite a bit as a result of that. And I just finished that story, and my brother said to me very quietly, "You know what I've never said before?" He said, "I ran away all the time." And I thought to myself, here's 2 children who are under the ages of 6 and 8, and they're running away from home. What is that telling you about what that home is like? That home was just filled with the tensions of having been through war. And in the case of my mother and grandmother, they went through the firebombing of Hamburg. So in 1943, there were 30,000 people killed in one night. And when I was a little girl, I would walk out the front of the building that we lived in, and at the front was just ruins. At the side there were ruins. Behind us there were ruins. Ruins was all I knew, because that's what Hamburg looked like, and that's where I was from, was Hamburg. So this is where I'm starting my little tale. That is what Hamburg looked like, and our building was fortunate enough to be a little island. What I didn't know as a 6-year-old, or even as a 14-year-old, or even later as a 40-year-old, was that my mother's horrible behaviors towards me were as a result of post-traumatic stress disorder. She had not only been through a firebombing, she'd been through being in a concentration camp as well. But as a child, you don't appreciate that. You want your mother just to be your mother, and she is not capable of that because of all of the trauma that she went through. So when we eventually made it to Canada, the reason there's a squirrel there is because all of a sudden there were trees. The streets were lined with maple trees. There were squirrels that scampered up them. I thought I had just come to this paradise. It was a Garden of Eden, Canada was. We were living in Whitby, Ontario, and even Hurricane Hazel occurred at that point. But I just thought it was quaint that we were cooking over the fireplace, and that my British aunt was making her tea, despite the fact, that we'd been through Hurricane Hazel, because everything was so lovely until this moment. I go to school, little German girl, do not speak one word of English, and I'm chased home from school being called a Nazi. Nazi! Nazi! Look at the Nazi! And I didn't know what a Nazi was. I'm 6 years old. I don't know what a Nazi is. So I went home and I told my mother, and I said, why, what is a Nazi? Tell me what a Nazi is. And she sat my brother and I down, and she got out concentration camp money that my grandmother had brought back from Theresienstadt. And with that concentration camp money, she tried to explain to us that there were good Germans and bad Germans. I was 6 years old. I don't care that there were good and bad Germans. I just didn't want people to chase me home from school. I didn't understand it. And so in some ways, I buried any of the talk that had to do with Jewishness, and I got on with my life. And I made a success of my life. And Grace and I have had this discussion because our books are about making successes of our lives. How is it that you take the trauma and you convert the trauma somehow into the resilience that allows you to make a success of your life? My brother was a professor of dentistry. I ended up being a high school principal. We had good lives. But that moment of being called a Nazi stays with you. And when I tell this story to children, and I've had this talk with children, I say how important name calling is. You don't realize that the name calling that you are doing can have lasting impact on those people who are being name called. And so always in the back of my head was, am I really a Nazi? I believed that I was possibly responsible for having caused the Second World War. That was always, I was an adult, but I still felt somehow this German guilt and this shame, just terribly ashamed of who I was. And the irony of that was, as a high school principal, I knew that my role was to make every single child feel proud of their heritage. And if I was doing that for every single child in my charge, why could I not do it for myself? So my mother died in 2000, I inherited all of the family papers. And the family papers included birth records going back to the 1700s for Jewish people. And all of a sudden, now I was old enough. Now I understood. I was Jewish. I had a Jewish heritage. Now, was I really Jewish? It's a matrilineal line, and under the Jewish law, I'm considered Jewish. But I had been raised as a Lutheran. I had been baptized as a Lutheran. I had been confirmed in the United Church. I was solidly brought up as a Christian person, but now I saw that my heritage going back for centuries was actually Jewish. So then I retired from teaching in 2002. And what is the first thing I did? I walked around Lake Ontario. And you might think, well, why the heck would anyone do that? When I discipline students, and you have to discipline students when you're a high school vice principal and principal, I always used to say to them, you can do anything at all in the world if you break it down in small enough components and you take one step at a time. And so I said to myself, I can walk around Lake Ontario. And when I started, I didn't know whether or not I could do it and finish it, but I did. Took me 40 days to walk around Lake Ontario, and I realized then that I was up for any of that. Then I thought, somehow I have to put the German war guilt to rest. Surely I know I'm not responsible for the Second World War, but how can I take the shame of Germanness away? And somehow or other, I think my grandmother spoke to me. And in the book, if you read the book, there is actually a scene almost as if my grandmother is speaking to me, because I decide I'm going to walk from Theresienstadt, which is outside of the city of Prague, in the river valley of the Elbe, all the way to Hamburg, to the city I was born. And that's the same walk my grandmother made in 1945 when she was freed from concentration camp. I thought it would be a lark. My husband called it the Apple Strudel March because I was just walking 30 or so kilometers a day. Then I was picked up, and next day I started at the same point. And I was not going through what my grandmother did when she went through what I call the Valley of the Shadow of Death in 1945. So the first task was to find the ancestral lands. That's what they were, Holocaust, Czech Republic. That's what it would have looked like when my ancestors were there. The surrounding picture is actually the graveyard where some of my ancestors are buried in Holocaust. And then I found these archival photos because even though my ancestors owned homes, and the name is Skranka, very unusual. And if you are doing any ancestry research, it's a blessing to have an unusual name. It really, really helps. So having that unusual name helped me find the ghetto houses, the specific ghetto houses in which my ancestors had lived so many centuries before. And then I went into that synagogue, that white building, and that's what it looked like. And in the book, I describe it as a well of faith that a person of any religion would want to visit. It is just such a calming place. And how did it survive? Because the other synagogue in that Hollow South was destroyed on Kristallnacht. So in, many, many years ago, right around this time, it was destroyed. But that building looked like an apartment building. And the Nazis were too stupid to figure out it was a synagogue. So it survived just because it was a plain Jane building. That building, by the way, is where my great-grandparents were married. And I have the documents to show that chuppah, it's called, is where my great-grandparents would have married. Empress Maria Theresa had quotas on where Jewish people could live. And if there were too many Jewish people in one community, they had to break off and go into other communities. And so I had ancestors in Holosov and also in a place called Horny Bekva. But then all of a sudden they opened up and Jewish people could move to Vienna. So that's where they went. That could even be my great-grandfather, because that's the building. I actually found this building through all of my researches. And Sigmund Freud used to be a high school. He studied in that floor of the building. He got his high school matriculation in that particular building. But it was a butcher store down there when my great-grandfather was there. So these are just scenes of Vienna where my grandmother grows up. That's her looking nice and sweet down there, if you can see. But she was a bad girl. The strain of bad girls runs deep in our family. So I come by my rebellion honestly. And she was so annoying, my grandmother, that they shipped her up north to Hamburg. And that is the picture of her looking quite beautiful there as a young woman. And this is this particular gentleman, and what is so ironic is there is a picture. My name is Littlefield, and I always used to joke that if my husband's family had been more industrious, it would be Bigfield. They come from a British background, and he has a picture of a man in his family with a black hat that looks just like this. Anyway, Jakob here had 10 children. Not one of them survived the Holocaust. Not a single one of his children survived the Holocaust. So this is his second son, my great-grandfather, and he went voluntarily to the Lodz ghetto, and because he thought he could live there as a proud Jew, and he died almost immediately because he was diabetic, and he could not get the food or the medication that he needed to survive. And then Rosa here, my great-grandmother, she was in her 60s. I already said I'm like 79. In her 60s, she was deemed as too insignificant as a worker. So she was deported and sent to Kelmno, where she died in a gas van. So that's the outcome for her. So then he had lots of money as a butcher, and he sent his son, the guy in the glasses there, on one of those ships that traveled around. Not the famous ship, the St. Louis. There were many ships with countries that wouldn't take them. And so he was on one of those ships that nobody would take. And 3 or 4 countries in the Caribbean rejected them. And then he ended up in Venezuela. And this beautiful young woman, she now lives in Houston, Texas. She was his daughter, and so that's how you get survivors, because that's my beautiful mother, who could have been a poster child for the Nazi party. She survives, and that little girl there with that haircut, that's me as a little girl. I like to say that, puberty was rough on me, but that is me. And then this is my mother's half-brother, I know I'm wandering away and I should actually have one of those sticks. But the family sent the males to safety. So one was sent to South America, and Godfrey on the far side there, he was sent to Britain. And they didn't send the women to safety. European culture, you protect your sons. So the sons and grandsons were protected. The women were left to survive on their own. Fortunately, they did. So where's the war guilt? My father was a soldier. He was a German soldier. He did not, he didn't sign up. He wasn't one of these people who at 17, 18 wanted to get his rifle. But on his 21st birthday, he was conscripted, and he ended up being sent to Operation Barbarossa. If this was my classroom, I would now make you answer the question, where did Operation Barbarossa go? I'm sure someone in here knows. It was the march into Russia. So my father marched into Russia, and he didn't tell a lot of war stories, but he did mention one that's funny. I'll tell the funny one first. He said they would march during the day, march at night and lay up during the day. And it was quite hot when Operation Barbarossa started. And they were carrying sacks or packs that were over 50 pounds. So there was a pond nearby, and his group stripped off all of their clothing, piled their guns and their uniforms, and splashed into the water. And they noticed on the other side of the pond was another group of men cavorting, splashing in the nude, also having a good time. And they just assumed it was German soldiers. But the wind carried the noise, and it was Russian soldiers who were over there. And both groups of men, my father said, backed out of the water, covered their genitals. They didn't care about anything other than covering their genitals and getting their clothes back on. And there's actually a writer, Thomas Carlyle, who wrote a book about clothes make the man. And I've often thought that if you made armies fight in the nude, it might be a better way of going about it, because it would be more difficult. You would see the humanity as opposed to what's in the uniform. So anyway, my mother is secretly with this German soldier, and it has to be secret because under the Nuremberg law, she's a Mischling, and she's not allowed to have relationships with an Aryan soldier. And on the far right was a project I did with young people where I gave them Conte, and I showed them pictures like this, which were from my great uncle, Willie Fick. He was a Catholic artist from the Dada period. And in 40 minutes, they had to draw their responses. And that particular young person in 40 minutes drew that picture of the oven. So it was a good experience for me to work with the students, but it certainly didn't help in terms of the German war guilt. So the walk starts in April, and all I see is this exquisite beauty. I'm walking through nature, and there's a Bible verse that says that there is a balm in Gilead. My goodness, is there a balm in nature? And I thought to myself, I'm walking in my grandmother's footsteps, and she had heard guns and stuff. I didn't hear guns, but she would have seen the same beauty. And that balm, after 18 months of being in a concentration camp, it must have been incredibly healing to see all of the beauties of nature. The other thing I did is I decided I was going to interview, and I can still speak German. I'm not, great at it because I stopped speaking it when I was 7 years old, but I can still speak it. I said to my tour company, find me Germans who were alive in 1945. I want to interview them and find out what it was like for them in that same river valley that my grandmother was in. So they rounded up at least 10, if not more people. And I sometimes did group interviews. This was my first interview. She was an artist. Sometimes I did solo interviews. And I started getting images of what it was like, but most significantly, I discovered that these witnesses, who you now see as old, they were all old, they were children. So I was getting the story of the firebombing of Dresden from someone who saw it as a 9-year-old with pieces of human flesh hanging off the wires. And I thought to myself, the incredible trauma these children went through when they saw all of this. And they shared all of that. They shared their experiences of the trauma. This particular woman saw the death marchers come by her house, and the image of that stuck with her forever. But this is the one guy who sticks with me forever. I interviewed him, and my husband is a retired federal crown attorney who has done war crimes prosecutions up to the Supreme Court in Canada. So when he discovered that this man was the son of someone who had been in Hitler's bodyguard unit, he took over the interview and just used me as the translator. And he tried to box this man in because he and his mother were there. They were trying to evade the sense of responsibility for their part in the war. But it was clear that that man's father had been guilty of some very atrocious war crimes. So then why does he come forward? Why does he, knowing that this woman is following in the footsteps of her Jewish grandmother, why is he coming forward to speak to me? And the answer is guilt. Like the same way as I felt the guilt of being German, he was suffused with the guilt of who he was in his background. So during all of this walking, I keep thinking, you got to sort through what this is about. You're walking, but you don't really understand what you're trying to find out by doing all of the walking. So I kept going back to my mother being in Feuervenger prison and what that must have been like for her to be in that prison, because she was 6 months pregnant at the time and had to hide her pregnancy or she would have been killed. So what is it like for this young woman to be in those circumstances? And that's what it looked like inside there, and that's her with her mother. But on the far right is my grandmother in Theresienstadt, and I couldn't forget that in the mornings that wagon brought bread to the inmates of Theresienstadt, but then later in the day it picked up all of the dead bodies. So it was double purpose, that particular thing. So my grandmother saw death all around her all of the time. So how did she survive? She went in as a solo person she was 44 years old. She was considered a worker. But look at the eyes of that woman at the end of it. Like, she's haunted. Now, the good news, it's hard to think of good news in these circumstances, but she worked in the department created by Viktor Frankl in Theresienstadt. And that department, he called it the Department of Mental Hygiene. And their goal was to give people meaning even though that they were about to die. So my grandmother's job, every day, she went and got a list of people, and with another handicapped man, she went and visited those people who were dying in the attics of the ghetto, mainly was where the old people were. And she engaged them in conversation to provide meaning. And that's the basis of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. It's really about the fact that you cannot change the circumstances you find yourself in. You can only change your reactions to them. And so she was working to change people's reactions. So this particular guy, I knew from Teachers College, Robbie Levac, lived to be 99, and he followed the walk all the way through. He's a character. If you read the book, he's there. And he was an RAF pilot. And so during the war, he flew 80 missions. You won't know what that means necessarily, but most pilots did not survive 20. So this guy must have had a halo over him to survive 80 missions flying. And so he came to my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and he spoke eloquently, and it was quite funny. But he said, you know, the only reason that Angie and her brother Michael are alive is because I was such a poor shot. So he was quite a good speaker. These other people, she's the one who arranged the tour, and the others are either friends or family or people who shared their background stories with me positively. So I had all of this wonderful walking experience through nature, but that one, I thought, you know, if there's a God, he's posed this picture for me, because there was one cloud over Germany, and there is a cloud over Germany, and the cloud over Germany is the Holocaust. So this is the blow up of that image. My grandmother is my idol more than my mother. Both of them went through the war. Both of them had horrific experiences. Both of them showed signs of trauma for the rest of their lives. But my grandmother got on with it. So she remarried. She married this guy in 1956. She had been trained to be a concert pianist. He was a concert master. They played music every day. And when I visited with them, they were making concerts. Like, the music sustained them. But she's my hero for another reason. And I always have trouble. I used to do this with my students, so now I'm warning you. Alert, alert, I have trouble getting through this story, okay? So this guy here, Rudolf Kinde, was damaged in birth as a forceps delivery, but he was a wonderful musician. And so he would dictate the music and as a composer. So in the concentration camp, there was no one to just transcribe the music for him. So my grandmother transcribed his music, and you can go on the web and find 2 of the pieces that he put together. Now, he went in there with his family, and all of them went on transports to Auschwitz. And when his mother went, she made my grandmother promise that she would look after him. And my grandmother did look after him, because they kept the handicapped people in special houses. Theresienstadt was a demonstration camp, so that when the Red Cross questioned what was happening in concentration camps, the Nazis said, go to Theresienstadt, which they had set up as this mock OK camp, where we had handicapped, where we had old people, where we had children, but it was all fake. Anyway, he was put on the last transport. They didn't know it was the last transport, but he was put on the last transport that was going to Auschwitz. And my grandmother went into the cattle car, picked him up, and took him out. Now, I find that emotional, because you have all these beautiful people you can save. Like, why does she go into the cattle car and rescue a disfigured person? And she does that because she saw the soul. So my trip then ends in Hamburg. The white building is the building where I grew up for six or so years. That's my husband, and this is a miracle. When I go to that house, it turns out a woman was living there still, who was there when we emigrated to Canada. And so I make connections with her by phone, and I arrive at her apartment, and she's, got everything set up for us for the visit. And she says to me, how's your brother doing? He was such a little professor. Well, he did end up being a professor. And she remembered everything about me and my mother and my grandmother. But the most significant thing was she said to me, let me be your Oma now. So, because I had lost mine. This one is in there with my husband in those statues. It was actually in Wittenberg or no, Tangermünde. We were stopped there, and they were in a tower as you went up. And I looked at them, and all I saw was Holocaust survivors. My husband looked at that and said, hey, take a picture of me with one of my friends here. And I realized we bring our own perceptions to things. And even though he had done war crimes prosecutions, he doesn't carry the background that I carry. And so I superimpose things where he does not superimpose things. That's my grandmother's grave. As I said, I'm wearing her sweater. Today I'm wearing a scarf from my grandmother. And she's buried with both of her husbands, one on top and one below. So this book that I've brought here today took 17 years to write. And the walk was in 2008. I kept writing it and rewriting it and rewriting it because I realized that there were so many things I was talking about in the book. I was talking about German war guilt, the Holocaust, my conflicted identity. Was I Christian? Was I Jewish? Was I Canadian? Was I German? What was I? And then the question of resilience. And I finally kind of answered that question about resilience because I think it comes from the ancestors. I think that we carry within our DNA certain traits that allow some of us to survive. And I got a resilience through my ancestors. And also, 17 years of writing is great therapy. You don't need to be paying for any, extra psychotherapy. The writing itself will do that. And although I'm not Jewish by faith, I now consider myself Jewish by heritage. And I'm very proud of that heritage. But you know what? I don't feel the German war guilt anymore. And I think that's part of the writing as therapy. And even though I met Germans who clearly did carry culpability, I leave those interviews whole in the book. I don't edit them. I leave them for you, the reader, to decide what you think about them. It's not up to me to judge them, but I want you to look at these people and decide what you think about them. So that's Walking with Oma. It's in memory of these ancestors at the bottom who died or went through terrible conditions. And this is the end for now, but that's my husband looking cheerful for a change. Our daughter, our granddaughters, she works as a fashion buyer for Holt Renfrew, and she graduates as a firefighter December the 5th this year. So the trauma, I say to our daughter all of the time, we're getting better generation by generation. And that's true. Trauma only continues if it's not confronted. You have to face the trauma head on, work through it, and come out the other end of it. And our families come out the other end of it. So thank you for listening. Now you get questions. Grace, come up here too. All right, any questions for us?
I'm sorry, a few of you may not have been here when I spoke, but
I always have questions.
I was going to say, Linda, you always have questions.
I'll just start with Grace because she went first. I was really interested in the idea of rescues, and we'll have to talk about that sometime. I thought that was really interesting. But what I also thought was interesting was that you talked about them, I'm not sure you used this word, but almost as serendipitous.
Yes,
Almost
yes.
as a gift.
yes.
And I wanted to ask you, I'm not sure how to quite pose this, but where is your agency? Like the way you describe it, it sounds like these things happen to you. But I, from listening to you, feel like you also, I don't know how to put this exactly, made them happen. Like they weren't just a serendipitous gift. And so I wondered if you could comment on that. I feel like it's what you were talking about resilience and agency. Because the way you talk about it, it was a gift to you, and it was a gift.
Yeah.
But I feel like you played a role in saving, I don't know if that's the right word, in saving yourself.
It's a really good question. For a long time, again, I'm going to agree totally with Angie by saying that writing such a story, such a life, is therapy. And I never, as I mentioned, I never expected to write this memoir. It happened quite mysteriously on some level. But yes, it is certainly therapy, because as I was writing the book, there in front of my eyes and in my mind came my father. And as both of my parents were in concentration camp. In fact, my father made a very important decision when the Nazis rounded up the Jews in their town of Częstochowa in Poland. They were supposed to go with their respective families to wherever. Nobody knew that they thought they were work camps. They didn't realize these places were death camps. Some were work camps, most of them were death camps. But my father had been, they had just been engaged to one another. And my father said to my mother, "We are going together." And she was shocked. My mother was a teenager, and my father was almost 10 years older than her, and he said, "No, we are a couple. We're going to go together." So she agreed with it. Their families were shocked, but it was because of my father's, whatever you want to call it, his feeling that this was something he was going to do. It was an active thing. It was a way of saying, I'm going to take control of this situation over which I have no control, but one thing I can do is go together with my, quote, wife. Because of that, both of them survived. My father saved my mother's life several times in the concentration camp, and it's all in the book. And it is amazing that he did that, because he was an inmate as well. He was a prisoner. But he had a way of somehow, he had a mission. His mission was to save my mother's life. And talk about Viktor Frankl.
No, I'm going to answer her question for you. Her agency comes out of not giving in to the circumstances of
That's
her
true.
family.
Well
So when she escapes into the French-Canadian community
That's
and
true.
then into the Italian community,
Yeah.
she's taking control and saying to her mother, I am not going to be stopped by you. And
right.
we've compared our stories. My mother
Yeah.
hated my success in life. She
Yeah.
did not want, like, mothers are supposed to like
Yeah.
your success. But both of our mothers were opposed to our success.
We were our mothers, both of them, and it's amazing. That transcends all cultures, all religions. Both of our mothers, we realized,
and the
as we spoke, were very emotionally damaged and could not allow us as their daughters to do well in life. They felt that that was a betrayal to them. And so
so the agency is to go against it.
Yeah,
Yes.
but I got that agency, of course, not from my mother, but from my father, who, in his own way, in his limited possibilities, said, I am going to do something in spite of what's happening in this war. And he was able to save my mother's life. There was a moment where she was in the line to be sent, because they were in a forced labor camp. My father was a welder, and the Nazis, this was a munitions work camp. So my father was creating the ammunition for Nazis along with others. But my mother was not a good worker, and so she was in the line to be sent to Treblinka, a death camp. And my father also, again, call it serendipitous, call it what you will, he was fortunate enough to he became friendly with one of the Nazi guards. They would have discussions with each other in a quiet moment, and my father would tell me when I was a child, you know, if it weren't for the war, we could have been good friends, he and the guard. And so the guard kind of looked out for him, gave him extra food, and gave my mother extra food. But one day, the guard came over to my father and said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Your wife is in the line to go to Treblinka. I couldn't stop anything because the Oberkommandant was right there. He would have shot me if I tried to do anything." And so what happened was, my father said to the guard, "Just tell me where she is," because these places were huge. He ran and ran to where my mother was standing in the line, and he said, "I saw her eyes. I knew she felt she was already gone. She was already not on this earth." And he said, there were German soldiers, dogs barking with rifles, shooting, etc. He said, "I didn't care. I just ran over to where my wife was, where your mother was," he said to me. "I grabbed her, took her out of the line." He said, "I didn't care if I lived or died. I just wanted to be with her." He grabbed her out, and somehow, he said, "No one shot us." And he ran back to where this friendly, German guard was. And the guard hid them. And not long after that, several weeks after that, the Soviet army arrived. And my father, as they were retreating, as the Nazis were retreating because they knew the Soviets would shoot them, my father, he said there was so much noise you couldn't hear anything. He yelled to that guard and said, "What is your name? Where in Germany do you live? Maybe we can meet each other after the war." But the guard didn't hear him. And anyway, the guard and all the others were shot by the Soviets when the Soviets arrived, which was an hour later. And so I think that, that sense of, in spite of all the awful stuff, my father had he had some sort of control. So I think maybe that's where that's coming from. And his love of language and culture, even though he didn't have access to education because of being Jewish and so on, at that time not allowed into any higher education. So he would take me to the library as a little child and show me the books and say, "One day you're really going to be able to read all these so much better than I can in English." And I became a university professor teaching issues of language and culture and identity. And of course my students, I would tell these stories to my graduate students, and they would say, "Grace, you got to write about it." I said, "Oh no, it's too difficult to write about this kind of stuff." And they said, "I don't know, you got to write your memoir sometime." And finally, when I started writing the memoir many years later, I'm now emerita, I'm retired. I have been sending emails out to my students. I actually met many of them, and they are so delighted. They said, "We knew you'd do it. We knew you would do it." And so I have to thank my students, my graduate students, who kept pushing me to write my story. And it reminds me, Dave told me, "You're a bit like Frank McCourt," who also, if you read Angela's Ashes, he was a high school teacher and started telling them all sorts of stories about his poverty-stricken life in Ireland. And his students kept telling him, "You got to write about it, Mr. McCourt. You got to." And my students would tell me, "We're doing the same thing to you." And it's interesting. So it's about people helping each other.
Any other questions? Susan?
Yeah, well, it sounds very difficult when you're the child of a Holocaust survivor. I guess you're really conflicted because on the one hand, I assume you want to make things better for your parents. You feel so terrible about what they went through, but at the same time, maybe you're very angry at them as to how you've got this sort of weird dynamic going on. Does that happen?
Yeah, it's exactly what it is, because you don't want to disrespect the people who've been through the Holocaust.
That's right.
Because they've had these horrible experiences.
Yeah.
But when they end up as parents and they really can't manage parenting because of their horrible experiences, you have to stop being the child who's suffered that and become the adult and appreciate what your parents and grandparents went through. And that is not a transition that every second generation person makes. A
No,
lot of the second generation people are still filled with anger and resentment
yeah,
against the upbringing and not dealing with what brought the parent to those bad parenting issues.
I would say we're the lucky ones, not just us too, but those of us who somehow were able to transcend some of the trauma to have a life. We are lucky because there are so many of children of Holocaust survivors who have not done well. They committed suicide. They're on drugs. They are in mental hospitals. I know some of them quite well, and I had several peers who committed suicide. So I would say that we are fortunate in that, in my case, and I have a whole chapter on that, how I met an amazing therapist, as I say, God rest his soul, who was able to, unweave, sort of find the different threads. What was as a result of the Holocaust, and in terms of my mother's very meager, very minimal ability to be a mother, and what happened to her before the war, because as I mentioned, she had emotional problems before the war, which I didn't know about because most of my relatives were murdered. So I didn't have that information. I found out about it through later on as an adult. So that's the interesting thing. Once you begin to unravel the situation, in my case, that liberated me. As I say, when I began, a weight was lifted off my shoulders, because as a child, if your parents have been through such a horror, like the Holocaust, or like any horrendous genocide, or any war really, how can you show them any anger or any, as a child does in a normal circumstance? You can't do that if you're a child of Holocaust survivors. Oh my God, no, the Holocaust is like the icon.
Yeah,
And
actually,
so it stops you.
yeah, it's not just that. Like the moment you express any emotion of any sort, you are overwhelmed by
Yes.
them going, well,
That's right.
you didn't have this happen to you.
And you
You
feel
didn't have that happen to you.
You feel tremendous
And
guilt.
so there's no voice for you. You are absolutely shut down.
That's right.
There's no capacity for you to have any child
Yep.
or teenage emotion, because whatever you have wasn't what they went through. And it's true, it
It's-
wasn't what they went through.
It's
They went
true.
through hell. But what about
But what happens to
what
the
about
little
the
children?
developmental stages of the child?
Yeah.
Like, do they stop because your parents went through the Holocaust? You
No.
have all these survivors who have these children. Do all those survivors not have a right to have a childhood or teenage years? And they didn't.
No.
We absolutely did not have that right to have it. Now, I spent a lot of time, 17 years, writing the book, because I reconciled with my mother in that book. As difficult as it is for me to reconcile, I recognize my duty as, again, I'm brought up in the United Church, the 10 Commandments. These are my parents. This is what I was given. And damn it, I'm going to honor them. And so I do. I end up honoring my parents in the book.
And my situation was different. I definitely honored my parents. However, my mother was so voracious in her, she was emotionally ill. That's the thing. She was, and in the 1950s, there was no medication. The only thing that was available was electroshock therapy, which my father did not want my mother to have because of possible side effects and so on. My mother was really very emotionally disturbed, and she was this way throughout her life. So it was really not possible for me to have a relationship with her, and to this day, to the day I die, I will feel very sad that I was deprived of the possibility of having a decent mother-child a mother-daughter relationship, but again, a higher force has carried me through. I know that. There's no other way to,
We're gonna have
To-
one
to
last
explain.
question from Linda, because I see all these treats that,
Yeah.
that Iris has
We
put
must
together.
It's a
So,
question to you, Angie, and if it's too personal, just ignore it, but I'm interested in how this plays out with your children, like, technically they would be Jewish as the
Right.
line passes through you. And I wonder how they experience the issue, you know, in terms of the movement of this trauma and this history, your history. How being Jewish has played itself out in your family.
not everyone in my family is interested in the Jewishness, but some of them are. And so I have a transgender niece who I took up to the Holocaust Center, and she spent hours there going through the display, because no one has ever talked to her about it. So that was her first exposure, and her twin siblings are going to come, and I'll do the same thing. I will give them the exposure. No one, I don't think, is going to feel the religious aspect of it, but I think that the good portion will appreciate that they do have that heritage. But as for the parenting, I keep saying to my daughter, my mother was terrible. I was pretty terrible to you, but I said, you've done a terrific job. So, and she has done a terrific job. So I said, you know, it's decreasing. Like, and I think that's the good part, because we read about the First Nations, and I know they have other issues as well, but the intergenerational trauma doesn't stop there, and a lot of it doesn't stop because there isn't the processing and the working it out. And our books are that. Our books are the working out of very complex issues.
Sure.
They're not easy books because there's a lot in them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good place to end, isn't it, Dawn?
Thank you both so much. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So.